and we're live. We're live. And it's April 3rd, which means Liberation Day was yesterday, which means we are all liberated today. It is Thursday, the 3rd of April, the year of our Lord 2025. It is 8 o'clock a.m. in Washington, in the suburbs of Washington, and in the wild, wild norths of rural Ontario. And folks, it is gonna be a great day. The sun is not shining, actually. It's kind of draining, dripping rain. The birds are not chirping, but Cactus,
I'm muted for.
We're watching Dog Shirt TV, an effing revolution in morning television.
you are watching Dog Shirt TV, and it is an effing revolution in morning television. And I want to tell you about three of the revolutionary features of Dog Shirt TV today. One of them is that every now and then we workshop something on the show. And you know, most shows don't do that. Most shows you get the polished, um, you know, some 12-year-old who didn't know anything wrote a script for so and so who also doesn't know anything, and that's what you get. And then they have an expert who they give 30 seconds to say something, and sometimes the expert isn't really an expert and doesn't really know anything. Not here. Here we, if Nastia says, hey, I need to workshop the script for the last episode of Escalation, I say, come on the show and let's just do it on the show. And we do it that way. Or if Alicia says to me, Ben, my book is coming out in a few weeks and I need to be able to, I need to be more comfortable talking about it. I say, all right, let's workshop that on the show and let's do like a dry run book talk on the show. That is one of the revolutionary features that we're just gonna workshop shit here sometimes. And you guys, Greek chorus members, YouTube watchers, you guys get to see the inside action of what it looks like when Alicia Wanless practices basically giving her book talk. Um, Second revolutionary feature. Sometimes, uh, 5 minutes before we go live, I get a text from the guest that says I'm freaking out. And in this case, I don't want to connect point one with point two, but sometimes people are nervous about appearing on this show. Lord only knows why, because they're talking to a woman with a cactus and a guy with a squirmy dog on his shirt. But sometimes they're nervous about it, and that's cool. We just wear that on our sleeves here. You see here, this is my sleeve. You can see I'm wearing it. And then finally, a third revolutionary feature of this is that there's a whole meta quality where we don't just do this shit, but that I kind of flag it for you. And so that heightens the, I don't know, the sense of irony or the sense of weird meta shit, because you're watching it and I'm talking about it. And then speaking of meta, Holly is grading me visually as we go. And so I just want to say that, look, we are not allowed to have fun anymore. And that has been reinforced. To anybody who doubts that, just look at Dog Shirt Daily, which I posted just shortly before, and look at the poor raccoon that was caught yesterday on Liberation Day by contractors hired by my neighbors. And I was told by Marco Rubio that if you come to this country and make a ruckus, you are going to get locked up. And that is what happened to that poor raccoon. He came to our neighborhood and he made a ruckus, and we hired contractors, or we didn't, but my next door neighbors did, hired contractors to lock him up, and he's going to be at some infamous prison in El Salvador before a federal judge even knows he was taken off the street. And I asked him about it. And I said to him, "Happy Liberation Day, dude." And he looked at me and he said, "Save that bullshit for your column." And that is exactly what I did yesterday. And so, look, we're not allowed to have fun anymore, but we are allowed to have Alicia Wanless freaking out, workshopping the way she's going to talk about her new book. So let's talk about that new book, Alicia
Alicia, I
Wanless.
love how you care and want to be excellent. I don't care anymore, and I don't care if I'm excellent. But I really appreciate,
We're going to cure you of that.
yeah, I really appreciate your desire to be excellent. I think we still need people like that. I'm not one of those people anymore. I mean, I could accidentally be excellent, but it's not like,
An accident.
yeah,
Kind of like,
yeah, pretty much. So I appreciate that about you. And also, I have to say, your lighting this morning is exquisite. You look like Carrie Lake, but like
ugh.
not an evil Carrie Lake, like a good Carrie Lake. And I love your mug. I mean, you're like a goddess this morning. I mean, you're glowing. You're going to be excellent, and that's my pep talk for you today. You're gorgeous. You're smart. You're enough, and certainly for this show, you're more
Makes
than
it harder.
Are you important question, since it's post-Liberation Day,
It's
and
Retaliation Day, actually. So
yeah. So
Yeah.
do we is the whatever products other than your face itself are gracing your face, are they from makeupaddict.ca?
I have no makeup on.
You don't have to answer that
Need
question.
makeup. She has a
I'm
she
joking.
has a naturally dewy glow. I mean, they should hire her as a spokesmodel for the non-makeup makeup. You know, they have makeup that you wear so that it doesn't look like you're wearing makeup, which is kind of counterintuitive, but it's actually a brilliant way to get your money when you don't wear makeup.
Yeah, a lot of the stuff that I have comes from the US, though, so that's going to be a problem in supply.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Um,
You need to
you got to
change that up.
change that. You got to buy only from makeupaddict.ca, which you brought to my attention, and which is an official
why do you say
non.
.ca? It's .ca.
I say .ca.
But then you guys didn't say USAID.
No, because it's USAID.
But
Well,
it's the weirdest.
USA, some people say USAID. It's
It
interchangeable,
just
actually.
I found it odd that most Americans, I mean, who seem to have known what it was, would say USAID. Like the one time you would spell out the entire acronym, when the tendency down there is to say the acronym like a
It
word.
is. I always said USAID.
Well,
Me
I
too.
say ca because for a very important reason, which is that it's funnier sounding than than CA. And when I'm talking about a product that in fact does not sponsor Dog Shirt TV, I always try to make it funny. So
Speaking of
with
funny, your chat today is funny.
the chat, as in
Yes.
the Greek chorus.
The Greek chorus is funny today, and Carol T already had me laughing when I really was trying to keep a straight face.
All right,
Does
I just
Ralph
want to
have a
say you're going to hear
voice?
some beeping,
Okay.
right, which is actually the puppy squeezing a toy that beeps,
Figured.
and she really likes it, and I'm not going to take it away from her. So if you hear something that sounds like a squeaker going constantly, which you might be hearing now, that is Cleo, and I'm not even going to mute myself. So we're going to make this harder for Alicia by having this beeping going in the background. Okay, Alicia, let's start with the title of your book. What is it called, and and why did we call it that?
Well, the book is called The Information Animal: Humans, Technology, and the Competition for Reality. And why was it called that? I mean, because we are information animals, and I'm not sure that we understand very well our relationship to information and how that is not just mediated, but completely interrelated with technology and the outputs we create using it, and how that ends up leading us into competitions, conflicts, and wars.
All right. I want to ask, at the highest level of altitude, what is the thesis of this book? Because I met you at, I can't, what was it, 2018 or something? And I don't know if I've ever told this story in public, but I met Alicia at a conference at Harvard Law School. And she was kind of mysterious because I knew almost everybody else in the room and we didn't know each other. And there were a lot of big name people in the room, and we were all going around in a circle, and everybody was talking about, oh my God, we have to do something about this disinformation problem. And then it was Alicia's turn to introduce herself. And because she's, Alicia, the self-introduction was a little bit obscure. Like I'm a consultant and I'm from Canada and I'm a graduate student or whatever. But and then she went off on this incredible rant about how we actually say we need to do something, but we don't have an agreed upon set of terms. We don't have an agreed upon definition of the problem. We really have no idea what we're talking about. Um, and um, and then um, and she basically just shut down the room because she was so obviously right. And then the funny thing about this, yeah, it was a kind of mic drop thing. And the funny thing about it is that everybody then pretended to agree with her rather than to have been contradicted by her. And the things that she said started showing up in all of their op-eds over the next couple years. And so I want to start with the question of, okay, like at the highest level of altitude, what is this book arguing? And I have to
This
retrieve the puppy while you talk. So I'm going to turn off my camera for a second.
Well, for me, this book is arguing that we haven't been looking at the information environment in a way that forms an understanding for how it is a system. We use these words, information environment, information ecosystem, and information ecology interchangeably, which doesn't make much sense when you think about the origins of the words. And we don't really know what it is. Everybody who's using these words tends to be talking about different things. The media studies person is talking about news media. The people who care about social media are talking about social media and the internet. People who are concerned about, I don't know, politics and democracy are really talking about decisions made regarding voting choices, for example. Lots of different scholars are coming at it from different angles, and they're not talking at all about the same thing. But then add to that, a lot of the research is just kind of done in silos and separately. So we're not building up any kind of scientific understanding. And in that, what it means is that we actually really don't know much. We are kind of taking guesses about cause and effect. It's really hard to study cause and effect if you don't know how the system works. You can make a lot of big claims and nobody can refute it. It's also really hard to be strategic. I come from war studies. And if you don't actually know your operating environment, you don't really know what are the range of choices available to you. You're not really making the best ones because you don't know what your options are. And it's incredibly difficult to think through that and then get ahead of a problem. So the status quo is that a problem comes up, it gets talked about a lot in the media, and everybody scrambles to try to find that one silver bullet solution to address that. And they keep trying it, and then they wonder why it doesn't work. And then the next cycle comes up, and all of the researchers and everybody moves to that next topic, and we really never get ahead. So the book is about a way of seeing the information environment, drawing from physical ecology, such that maybe if we build this up over time, we can figure out how ecosystems work and what might be best to foster resilience within them.
And there are a lot of people, and I promise you this, who are going to read this book and are going to say, this is a counsel for not doing anything. Alicia is disparaging everything we're trying to do, and she's telling us we don't know enough to do anything. And she's proposing 100 years of study. And we have some problems right now. These emaciated teenage girls, Russians taking over our country, and we have to do something right now. And you're telling us that everything we're trying to do is useless and under-theorized. But I don't really have 100 years to wait for you to develop an entire field. What's your response to that?
Well, I think we're never going to have a field if we don't start. So maybe the people 100 years from now will be happy for us if we at least started that. It doesn't mean that we can't do things now. I think we need to be careful about what we do, especially at a content level. And what I mean here is that, especially on something like disinformation, the real issue with it is that by the time it's present in an information ecosystem, it's an idea. It's already a topic, which means it's also already in people's heads. And trying to get something out of people's heads is incredibly difficult. It becomes very politically challenging as well, because if there are enough people who share a particular idea, chances are there will be some politicians who try to grasp onto that and then support that idea. And now every time you're trying to get rid of it, those people who hold that belief will feel targeted. This kind of instigates an information competition within a society that just escalates. So I think what I would say is, why don't we look at more structural issues that may be causing these things? It's not hard. Again, I think that there are frameworks we could apply now that could get us to more immediate interventions that are less potentially problematic. So what I mean here is that go and assess a national information ecosystem, but take a systemic approach of this. Go and look at the people. Who are they? The demographics, what kind of communities they build around their languages, where, what kinds of ideas, what kind of capacity do they have for processing information? Is that changing over time? How are they actually communicating or processing information? Who controls those services? What's the underlying technology? How might that be shaping things? And also, what kinds of outputs are actually available? And do they meet the needs of people for what they're supposed to be doing in that society, say, being an informed voter? Now, a lot of that research, at least 60% of it, you can find measurements in most information ecosystems already. It's just a matter of connecting those experts to put that picture together. And if you have that, then you can start to look at something like the national information ecosystem to say, maybe we're dependent on a technology provider from country X that is actually really hostile now, and this is shaping things. We need to make an investment that's going to allow us to have maybe a little bit more sovereignty around how our people communicate. It will be different in each ecosystem, but that's possible, and it can be done in a matter of months. Now, this has to be carried forward, is what I would argue, is that we need to develop a field that allows different disciplines to come together to see how their research fits in to make the sense of the system over time. And I think if we build up that, we may actually be able to come up with better strategies to understand what's making one ecosystem more resilient than another, and if that can even be applied to another ecosystem.
I have a question, Alicia. So to me, and again, I haven't read your book yet. I'm sorry. I'm going to get your
It's
book.
not out. It comes out in Europe and UK on May 22nd.
I haven't read it because I
and
read
North
all
America in
books
September.
already out, and yours isn't out, so that solves that. But to me, like, there's sort of a fundamental problem in that I feel like in any sort of institutional or, top down or policy, you need trust for any institution to sort of work. You need trust, and the misinformation situation has completely at least in our society. Maybe in Canada it's not as bad, but there's zero trust anymore. And to me, that's one of those squishy things. It's like when you have no trust, when the experts aren't trusted, when the institutions aren't trusted, when basically nobody and nothing is trusted, it's like, it's like putting a marriage back together after there's been an affair or whatever. It's not, I'm sure it's not impossible, but it's like, how do you rebuild that trust? Anyway, I'm gonna shut up.
I mean, I'm not an expert in trust. I am trying to put together a
Nor is
more
she a
global
marriage counselor.
I
of
think
the
the entire
information
country needs to go
environment.
into therapy, but I don't think that's feasible, is it?
I think trust is generally a very hard metric to use for anything. I completely hear what you're saying. I think that I look at a country like the US and even in Canada, and I think that it is, as a society, already torn apart by a very heated information competition. And just to give a definition, an information competition is where one community seeks to impose its idea of reality on the whole, and another one disagrees, and they compete in this. So they're really just trying to get the public to buy into their worldview, and this gets worse if those realities are incompatible with each other. I think in the US, one side of this information competition has been very clearly aware that it is in an information competition for decades, and the other one perhaps has not. What I fear in watching this is that the other side is now thinking that it needs to engage and escalate. Now, to be clear, I'm one person putting forward an idea of looking at a system, and I've only looked at case studies that are in the lead up to a conflict. There may be examples from societies where they didn't end up in conflict that provide some sort of key. But for me right now, watching the US, it is clearly in the pattern that I saw in the 5 case studies that I looked at for the book.
All right, let's talk about those case studies, because you just talked about case studies without having introduced the idea that there were case studies, and we don't want to do that. So, Alicia, one of the interesting things about this book is that it's based on these 5 historical case studies. And of course, only one of the societies among these historical case studies had an internet. Uh, but why should we look at information ecosystems in these protean forms like Athens and Sparta and England under King Charles I, rather than just accept that our situation is so radically different that we have nothing to learn from these puny ancients who didn't even have a good enough diet to grow big and strong like we do, and don't eat beef tallow and, take ivermectin.
Are you taking ivermectin?
No, I hear a big ivermectin influencer just died.
Okay. So it's a matter of developing theory, and theory needs to be able to endure beyond a single point in time. I think this is a big challenge in the way that we've been historically, not historically, but definitely in the recent times, looking at the information environment. We're only really looking at the now. And again, that leads us to react, but it doesn't give us a longer term picture. So that means that if we don't get that longer term view, if we don't develop a theory that can explain the information environment over time, we will be doomed to constantly react to whatever the latest threat is, whatever the latest technology is. So in order to develop theory, I had to go back in time to look as far back as I could, which meant that I went as far back as I could that I could access at least some sort of primary sources or accounts that there was some documentation that might give me a picture of what that information ecosystem looked like. So I started with ancient Greece and the lead up to the Peloponnesian War. It was a few hundred years after a writing system had been developed. So the innovation there is writing. Then I moved to print. So my case studies were based on other comms theoreticians who said that we have epics built around specific technology. So oral, with the introduction of writing just after that, print. So I looked at the English Civil War in early modern Britain. Then I split up the print age to include steam. This was not put forward by others, but it seemed like a change. So I looked at the American Civil War, the period leading up to it. For the electronic age, it was the Vietnamese independence struggles. So starting with their attempt to liberate themselves from France. And then the last one was Ukraine and the first Russian invasion before 2014. And I looked at the decades leading up to this, first because I thought maybe about a generation it would take for people to kind of be influenced by certain things. But what I often found is that the long tail of history would still have an impact on people and still does today. I think in terms of some of the ideas that we bring up, for example, like democracy.
All right, and I'm curious what you take from these case studies. Like, so what is, are there 5 different lessons from 5 different case studies, or do all this case studies prove the same broad point? So if you look at these 5 points in history and actually learn something about the and by the way, one of the most interesting things about this book is the accounts of the information ecosystems in these different societies, where we think of all sort of pre-modern information ecosystems as similar, but they're actually not. And they're getting inputs from radically different places. This has, of course, a relationship with our conversation the other day about the Greek chorus, right? That's actually playing a role in an information ecosystem in Athens and probably less so in Sparta. But what is the big lesson from these historical case studies, or what are the big lessons?
I think the big lesson is that the information environment that we have today is not entirely separate or different from everything that came before. It is built up over time. We didn't stop speaking a language together simply because we had writing or we had books or we had the internet. It just evolves over time and it builds on whatever we had before. The second thing would be, well, first I want to kind of go back and explain things a little bit more, because I haven't even told you what an ecosystem is or what the information environment is. And I keep using these words and I accused other people of not giving them meaning. So the information environment for me is a global space simply where information exists and all of the conditions that may be impacting it. So things like economy, climate, geography, etc. The ecosystems are something that emerge around a shared idea that gets developed by people using various means, tools, technology, whatever, to develop outputs. And they share that amongst each other. And around that, an idea kind of encapsulates it. So this could be as basic in today's society as a Facebook group around women sailing. This creates a community. They're using technology. They're talking about a topic and they see themselves as a sense of community. It could be as small as a, university or class built around a shared idea, concept of that organization, or a country. So the United States is an information ecosystem bound by laws that govern its ICT use. There's a sense of shared nationhood to a degree, and they can be a variety of sizes. Now, one of the things that was challenging is that looking at the literature that came before, we use these words, there may be a definition like I just gave, which lists things, but there isn't really an explanation of it. There is an information theory, but it's really about making sure that what's being communicated through that technology remains what the person had intended. So it's about getting transmission. which is great for that, but not sufficient for the complexity of people, tools, outputs, the interrelationships between them, and the conditions that may be impacting them. So I turned to physical ecology to try to find some sort of approach that may be drawn from, and I got inspiration from ecologists. One of the promptings came from Ben on one of our many conversations in the development of this book, but I ended up looking into the history of ecology and how the field developed, and found people like Alexander von Humboldt, who before him, people really just kind of thought they could control the environment for their own good. There wasn't a lot of thinking about how interconnected it was. And
Leave
he
it
was
to
the
a
first.
Prussian to say, you cannot control the environment. You have to understand it.
And so he goes off on this tour down to South America, where he encounters colonialist practice of clear cutting forests. And the locals inform him that this is having a really bad impact, right? They're having mudslides, landslides, the ecosystem is being ruined. And he gets introduced to this idea of the environment being a web of life. There's a great book by Wolf about the history of ecology and Humboldt's contribution. And so what he really sees is that this is super interconnected. And so he, among many, start documenting ecosystems, taking measurements and seeing how they actually work together. And ecologists eventually find things like the food chain or the food web, and they see how intricate it is. And it took, 100 years. And it really wasn't until the 50s and 60s when this field starts to come into its own as a response to something, which is a threat in pollution. But they weren't able to achieve these things without that understanding of the system. So putting my explorer hat on, I did my best to go back in time and see what I could see about those ecosystems, looking again at the people, the means, the outputs, and the conditions impacting them. That doesn't answer the question about the ecosystems, but I'm going to stop there to pause for questions.
No, I want to go back to my original question, which before you went off on this history of ecology, Jag, what are the lessons that you take from these
Right.
5 case studies?
So, my first lesson is that the information environment builds over time. And I think that we have to take that into account, because what happens is we just really think we're going to intervene on that latest technology or that latest threat. And really, there's a deeper layer here. And if we don't see all of those things at once, our interventions could be misguided, much like introducing cane toads into Australia. But I'm going to park that. Then it's kind of different things. One is that I think there's an illusion that leaders have that you can control an information ecosystem, that somehow ecosystems are separate and apart from each other. And this goes way back. Athens was a very open ecosystem. Sparta was a very closed one. Sparta was able, I think, at that time to close it, but also that's a matter of the fact that there wasn't a whole lot of documentation at the time about societies. I think that would be a lot harder now. But you move forward to England, and yes, for a few decades, England had been pretty cut off because of the Protestant Revolution. They weren't traveling. When you get James into power, he opens it up a little bit, and you get more on the continent. But at the same time, England never was really able to stop the flow of information coming in from the continent, trying to provoke them into this what was then a European global kind of war around religion between Catholicism and Protestantism. And it was flowing in from Scotland, which he was also the king of, and he still couldn't control it. It was flowing in from Belgium and other countries. And so the other lesson is no ecosystem is really an island. It's very difficult to control it. And once ideas are in people's minds, it's really hard to get them out of it. I think there's other lessons too in terms of things that will happen. So if a new technology is introduced into an information ecosystem, there are some factors that tend to follow. One is that you're going to have more people who are going to be able to engage with that, with information that is being produced through that new technology. So whether that is an ability to read or an ability to access it, you should expect that there will be more people engaged in a public discourse. There are issues around opening and closing of information ecosystems. The more that you change those rules, the more kinds of disturbances you may get, the more likelihood of information competition. Also, information pollution is a problem. which stems from both the new technology facilitating it, but also it's a really big byproduct of information competitions. What else? I don't know.
What about, like you said, it's really hard to control information ecosystems, but I mean, obviously there's some dictatorships get I mean, North Korea, that's got to be pretty, pretty close to full control, wouldn't you think?
It is. It is. I think that there will be questions for North Korea as some aspects of it have opened up more recently in sending workers to go work in China, also the soldiers in Ukraine. Again, we were discussing this on a different show. One of my colleagues from Carnegie had come on, Darcy, who specializes in the Koreas. And there's a question of when those people come back, what the impact of that will be, how much that can be tightly controlled. I think there's a question here too of sustainability. You know, the Soviet Union managed to control a vast information ecosystem that had many different smaller ecosystems in it for quite a long time. That doesn't necessarily mean that everybody within it bought into the idea, nor could they manage that for a longer time. I think there's also questions too about how healthy that is for society in terms of, I don't know, economics, well-being, etc. Again, I am trying to take a longer term view of these things. And so when we're talking about today, it's hard to say where some of those things may go.
There's,
Yeah.
oh, sorry, go
Sorry,
ahead.
go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to say, yeah, I think in general, dictatorship just on multiple fronts is not terribly sustainable. But I wonder, it seems to me that, and again, maybe I'm not looking at an ecosystem. Maybe I'm doing what you have said not to do, which is sort of isolate certain things. But it seems to me that our current situation is such that there's a market. I mean, I wonder what the role of the market is. Like ideas that feed some need that people want. And I think the appeal of propaganda or misinformation is that it can be designed. It's kind of a designer idea product, where you can literally, create a narrative that just hits all of the erogenous zones of a certain group of people, their fears, their hopes, their dreams, their, deepest needs. And so I wonder if you see that in sort of the past of sort of ideas, the marketplace of ideas being something that was considered. Certainly advertising, I mean, with the modern advertising, that's what advertising kind of is, right?
Yeah, it didn't come from a void. I guess I wouldn't call it the marketplace of ideas, but I would say that the market and people profiting from the information ecosystem has always been there, going all the way back to the sophists who were hired to help politicians in Athens make arguments to persuade voters to do what they wanted. So this act of persuasion has been there as far back as I could go. But then also what happens is every time you kind of get a new technology coming in, it's driven by profit, right? The printing press was driven by profit. And so you see in early books, it's really about hitting the biggest market possible. Actually, the modern English language develops with the dialect that it did from the middle of England to hit as big a market as possible, because before this, the dialects were almost not really intelligible. There were jokes about stories in the past where people in the same country didn't even understand what each other were saying. So, language is developed by books, which is driven by being able to sell to generate a profit. But then in this period as well, you get this emergence of pamphlets. And so in early modern England, pamphlets are more popular than books. They're smaller, they're shorter, they're easier to do. And they're on a range of things, right? Some of them are pushing a harder version of Protestantism that the Puritans want. Some of them are just about crazy, bizarre shit, human deformities, monsters, basically, disinformation to sell because that's what people want and they're entertained by it. And then you also have the counter of this, where the king is trying to like convince people that, the monarchy is great and you should just follow him because, well, he was got a God-given right. That's oversimplifying, but it's always been there. This need to make profit, this need to feed people what they want, the use of, not just by those trying to get profit, but also people who are proselytizing an idea or who are seeking political power to use those means, often in conjunction with people making money, to get their idea across and convince people. So I don't think that, this idea of needing to persuade, needing to make money, the connections between them is entirely new. The business model problem has always been there.
I guess what I'm getting at is for like sort of authoritarians and the sort of authoritarian types of leaders and systems, obviously brute repression is and control, like total control, is a pathway. But what it seems like a lot of, like Russia, for instance, instead of sort of, I mean, they still use obviously repression, but they're really marketing as more of a they're using marketing of ideas more than maybe they used to. Like their ideas have a narrative that appeals to people, even Russians, I assume, but I guess that's always been there. But it seems like a more sustainable model. Like if you're wanting to control if you're an authoritarian and you want to establish control, brute repression is really inefficient. Like it's much better to create narratives that people glom onto voluntarily and perpetuate, and then do the work for you by, they're true believers and they're sort of buying into your system via these information narratives.
Now you're talking about some of my earlier work around participatory propaganda.
Okay, well.
All right. I want to go back to the high arc thesis of the book. And there are a lot of books about the information world. My friend Renee DiResta has a new one. Yuval Harari has a famous one. And I'm interested to have you situate this book amidst the existing literature. How is it different?
One, I understand that Renee's recent book is very much about our time now, about the current state of technology and looking at the information environment now. Um, Yuval Harari's book does take a more sweeping look at things. He is talking about networks, which I think are similar to an idea of information ecosystems. Again, he's very focused on AI and how that's going to be changing society. What I'm trying to do here is actually advocate for how we could build a field that could make sense of information ecosystems and the information environment overall, over time, and around the world. So it's not just about today, it's about how we go forward in the future and really try to make sense of this, and how do we pull different disciplines together and what would be required to get there.
All right. Yeah, I want a little bit more about that. It seems to me that there are, if you decide as a citizen of whatever society you're in, that the information ecosystem is a problem, and you could mean that from a lot of different points of view, right? You could be like, oh my God, how did somebody as ignorant and foolish and malevolent as Donald Trump get elected? It has something to do with the information ecosystem. Or you could be asking, why does my 15-year-old daughter want to starve herself to death? Or you could be asking, why do my neighbors all believe these things about vaccines that are patently untrue, and won't, and prefer to get measles than to have a shot that won't have any real side effects. there are a lot of reasons why you could decide that the information ecosystem is a problem. And when you do, um, why should somebody read your book about about the problematics of the ecosystem and the question, rather than any of 100 other books that in the broadest sense cover the same ground, or at least treat the same subject?
Right. And I think what the instinct would be on any singular topic is to go directly on that topic, right? So if the question is, why did people vote a certain way, they're going to want to go and read a book that tries to explain to them why people voted a certain way. I think the challenge with that is if we don't actually understand the system where it occurs, we may not actually be designing the research question or perhaps the experiments that we would be doing to get to that answer correctly, because we're making certain hypotheses. So what happens often in research today is that somebody may believe that it's social media that's causing it, so then they immediately go to try to create a study that's going to show that social media either does or does not cause, let's say, political polarization. I think the challenge with this is it isn't necessarily, at least in a scientific way, considering all the other variables that may be going into shaping people's perspectives. And so jumping to a conclusion that it may be one, two, or three variables, when actually there's a whole lot that goes into a person's forming of a worldview that starts with them in childhood and includes things like education and the people they talk to on a daily basis, what they might be doing, what other forms of information they may be having access to. Yes, social media may be a part of that, but it could be a lot of other things. And then in the absence of us having built up a systematized approach to looking at all of those different variables on a group, just doing that one type of research isn't going to get us to that wider answer. Now, I like to use an example from physical ecology of how having a systems point of view led to an actual answer, and that is in DDT, if you will. Forgive me for going into a story. But what happened was in the 50s, there started
Never
to be
apologize for going into a story. It's part of our information ecosystem. We're storytelling animals.
Right, exactly. So what happened was in the 50s, there was a discovery that falcon eggs and other birds of prey were becoming thin to the point where they weren't able to procreate, they weren't breeding. And the hypothesis was that this was happening after the introduction of a pesticide, in particular DDT. And they knew this because there was people who had been collecting eggs for decades. So there were people who that was their thing, and you could go back and you could look at when the eggs started to thin. Okay, cool. There's a hypothesis. There's an idea that it's cause and effect. So what researchers did was they started feeding falcons DDT directly in lab experiments, but that didn't lead to egg thinning. And that's because birds of prey don't actually experience DDT directly. They get it through the food chain, eating other animals who have ate other animals. And by the time it gets to them, they're getting a byproduct called DDE. Exactly. And when a researcher who was both very much into birds and a toxicologist decided to do a different experiment, he understood that there was a food chain. He understood where the falcons sat in this, and he fed it a byproduct called DDE, and he was able to replicate the egg thinning that had been experienced in the wild, which then led to more concrete proof that DDT was in fact causing this. And then that led to the environmental movement that was able to stop its use. Now, I just want to pause there because there is a key thing that is very similar to what's happening in the information environment today. And that is that you have the first studies that fed DDT, which are still pointed to today by people who want to reintroduce DDT because they want to sow doubt. And I think this is the challenge when we don't have a systemic understanding and we do these very direct experiments, they end up canceling each other out. And so for one study that says social media is causing polarization, another one might say that it isn't. And companies then can point to the one that refutes it and say, no, we don't really need to do anything and we don't need to study anymore and everything's fine. And then that means that we can't actually, get ahead. So what I'm saying is that if we don't have that understanding of the system, if we don't know how information's moving between people, if we don't have a means for making sense of it, these experiments end up kind of not being pointless, but not being situated in how the world works.
All right. Let's talk about some of your later case studies. Whenever you talk about your case studies, you focus on Britain before the English Civil War, but you have some later case studies, particularly modern Ukraine, that are more diverse in terms of the inputs. They look a little bit more like a modern ecosystem. What do we learn from them? Also, the U.S. Civil War, pre-Civil War in ecosystem.
There's a couple of things, especially looking at Vietnam and Ukraine, that stand out. When you have an ecosystem that has been heavily controlled and suddenly there is an opening and people within it are exposed to either new parts of the world, new people, new ideas, it becomes really hard to then reimpose controls. You tend to get an influx of new ideas, which then can lead to an information competition. And if the existing leaders are not capable of adapting with these changing beliefs, that's where you start to end up seeing problems that develop further. So in the case of Vietnam, it had been controlled by France. It was colonized by France for a while. They had very strict rules around the information ecosystem, what could be done. They could control education, they could control printing. And then the steamship happened, and telegraph, and also the First World War, and a lot of Vietnamese went to go fight for France. There was also a practice after that of exiling political dissidents to other parts of the empire where they were exposed to other dissidents in other countries. And so what happens is you get this emergence of an idea that the Vietnamese are shaping around independence. And also an expectation that they should get more independence for helping France. And they actually request this at the League of Nations, and they're turned down. And so all of these expectations are built, and these ideas are being formed, and it's not being met. And then at the same time, after the war, you get this blossoming of print, which for whatever reason, doesn't have a lot of controls. There's a change not long before that in terms of the alphabet, which makes it easier to read. More people are starting to read. And so with this opening, with this increase of people able to participate, you get this demand that is not being met, which really becomes the basis of the independence movement that is central to their subsequent wars. In Ukraine, what you have is after the fall of the Soviet Union, where the Soviet Union had heavily controlled the information space, you have this first an opening and reckoning of all of the bad stuff that happened to Ukrainians under the Soviet Union. And then you get a government that just really, for decades, just can't seem to meet the needs of the people or care. In different flavors. There's a lot of levels of corruption. You also have a society that's highly educated. So this is a smart society that is diverse. It's diverse in the sense of the dialects and regionalisms that happen. That is not to say that there isn't a Ukrainian identity, but there are different senses of identity that are pulling at this fabric. There are all sorts of challenges around media that happen around controlling of it off and on. A lot of the media is mostly driven by oligarchic interests in the lead up to 2014, which leads to a phenomenon that the Ukrainians call dzinza, which is paid for advertising dressed up like journalism. And so you get this very polluted information ecosystem, but yet with a very bright and educated population whose needs are consistently not being met by the government, kind of ignored. And by the time you introduce this kind of bigger competition between East and West for the country, this explodes into a wider information competition that sucks the people up, and they end up protesting. I think Maidan is very interesting to me because I think from an outsider, we've really reduced it to a binary opposition of a choice between East and West, but underlying it is this like just Ukrainian drive for something better of their leaders and for their country.
All right. So we have 6 minutes left, and this is the part where why I invite the audience to jump in and bombard Alicia with out of left field questions of the type that would be represented in an audience, in which some people are not operating with the same set of facts that others are, and some are operating with various clinical conditions. And so if you have a faintly deranged question to throw Alicia off guard, this is your chance. And if you don't have one, make one up.
I thought that's what I had already done. So
No, you were on this side of the same moral universe but there's always one person when you give a book talk who's, and sometimes it's, crude, sad stuff like, can you help me with the CIA people who've installed listening devices in my teeth? But
That's happened.
Oh no, that always happens, and it's, but sometimes it's more intellectual and less obviously deranged, just coming from a place you completely didn't expect. I'm in a bad position to do this to Alicia because I have been raising my questions as the book has developed. And so I don't really, but you guys, and, John Hawkinson, I'm looking at you. You should pop up and ask the question that she is least expecting.
wow, he's shutting you down.
He is
Can
shutting me
I
down.
just
Laura Donna, why
Fred,
aren't you?
I want to share what Fred has said in the chat because it is exactly it. And I've used a different analogy, but he said here we're still at the level of alchemy for information analysis. We need a theory of chemistry. And one of the things that I said in the original thesis was that we're at the place of medieval medicine where we get somebody giving you a stink eye or there's a volcano going off and we think the god is mad. Like we're there when it comes to the information environment, and what we need to do is develop basically not just a theory but a field. So information ecology. Laura Donna.
You can pick one. Are there examples or more examples, you may have already given some, of people failing to understand the systems view of the information environment, your thesis, and mucking around and failing spectacularly or just having an adverse effect? Or have you seen people either understanding or not understanding your main point and doing something that worked to fix the environment?
Well, first I would say to fix is really a challenge because we don't really know, okay, that is one key difference between what we have in physical ecology and what we have currently in understanding of the information environment is at least we had some sort of sense of what a pristine ecosystem looked like before humans came and mucked with it. We don't really know what healthy looks like. We use these words, but I think that a lot of it is just guessing based on values for that particular system, right? So we talk about like free, diverse, plural media, all of these things. That's because that's become tied with democracy. So fixing is a challenge. But in terms of where I think someone intuitively understood what the information environment was, how ecosystems are interconnected, is actually in Ho Chi Minh. I think that he understood that the Vietnamese ecosystem was not separate. He understood that the American one and it were very much tied, and constantly tried to like reach out to the Americans and appeal to them in certain ways. They also understood that education was key to spreading ideas. And so they would create these cells in each village that they had gotten into that kind of really co-opted the people inside of it. It had education and literacy in particular built in. There would be a little printing press so that they could actually create material for it. And I think he also really understood how you turn what is, called in like IO circles the propaganda of the deed on its head to demonstrate that somebody else's actions are saying something other than what they mean, right? In the case of DM, that he wasn't actually really democratic, he was repressive and cruel. So I think he intuitively understood that that he is a part of the ecosystem and that everybody else is, and that you have to kind of foster this interconnectivity, and you have to allow people or enable people to be able to participate. I think another person, I know Ben's like, you keep going back to England. I don't know why. It's just one that I really enjoyed. But John
You just
Pym.
like it because he got his head cut off.
I am feeling very anti-monarchy these days with
I'm
the lack of
just
support
saying,
for Canada.
every draft of every article has had this reference to Charles lost his teeth and his head. And I think this is just the Alicia's bloodlust.
Yeah, maybe it's like too much Alice in Wonderland as a kid. I mean, there's a painting right here that I look at that I got in England. Anyway, actually, no, this isn't about Charles, it's about John Pym. He was one of the parliamentarians, and he seemed to also really understand that there were multiple people and voices in this. So he would really kind of get the apprentices who were becoming far more literate than they ever had been, and engaging them in politics and encouraging, mobs and petitioning, and really just kind of, again, Holly, coming back to like participatory propaganda, getting the audience bought in to become the propagandists and engaged in it. And there is a great author who my name is not, my brain is not picking up, but she really discusses how he seemed to understand that they were in a dance with each other and how that force could be used. So I think there was some sort of intuition there that it is more of a system and how there are dynamics. And it's more about kind of winning a message. It isn't getting to where we need to be on understanding the information environment, but you've got glimmers of hope, people who could at least intuitively see the system.
We are going to leave it there. Alicia, you can stop freaking out now. And Holly,
Excellent. Everyone in the chat was talking about how smart you are.
yeah, the chat is full of your praises, Alicia, and we're going to be back tomorrow with another one of Alicia's guests. Alicia, tell us who we're going to have tomorrow in Psychology Week.
Right. We did have Psychology Week. I apologize in advance. That's my bad booking. But we are going to have Dr. Amy Brunel, and she's going to be talking about narcissists in most people's daily lives. So this is about the narcissist in your family, friends, romantic partners, coworkers, or bosses.
Presidents.
No.
That's not in your daily life, Ben.
Okay.
I mean, that is, but it's not direct.
So,
yeah.
we're all just going to be thinking about him without actually mentioning it.
Yeah,
And
I'm
our guest is
invested in this conversation, and that's
very much personal lives.
Yeah, it's going to be all about our personal lives.
Well,
we are
because we deal with Ben every day.
It's true, and I am a narcissist. I am such a narcissist.
I'm just.
Meanwhile, it's all about me, and I'm declaring this show at an end.